And then I will talk briefly about this conference and the one that preceded it, because I see this conference as a development of that one. Okay. The human economy. It is difficult to be brief, but let me give you one key point, and then I'll explain it. The key point is that the human economy is all around us. It's here, it's out there, it's across the whole world. You may say, when you hear that from me, you may say, so what? Well, just consider the fact that a whole bunch of institutions, including prominently Oxfam International. Oxfam International has, for several years, back in the middle of this past decade, they wrote reports to the World Economic Forum. Every year they sent in a report. You've probably seen them. So to Davos. And every year they came up with what we called killer facts. You know, 6 people in the world, all men, own as much wealth as half the world's population. They put that kind of statistic in their report. And then they'd tell the World Economic Forum, the Davos crowd, they'd say, you can't expect there to be a human economy in a world in which these killer facts are true. And then they'd tell the Davos crowd, governments of states, the big corporations, they'd tell them what they had to do to introduce a human economy. And their recipe, without fail, year after year, was to say, governments must start governing in the interests of their citizens. And the big corporations must change their business models and become more caring. And as Keith particularly said, Keith Hart particularly said, what are they trying to do? I mean, what's the incentive? Do they really think Davos is going to listen to this? There's no incentive for these people to change at all. But they have also introduced, they are, at one level, they're agreeing, it would appear, diametrically with the World Economic Forum's people. So they are criticizing them, even if rather tangentially. But at another level, they actually agree. They're saying nothing is going to happen in the world of any significance until you guys at Davos, the big corporations, the governments of the world, nothing is going to happen until you mend your ways. In other words, the rest of the world, the people who are sitting with, all their collective wealth is equal to 6 people's, are passive. Nothing happening. Now, what they've clearly bought into, and it's both sides there, is the economists' model of what agency is. And we know this, incidentally, from the Fintech discourse, put out by the IFIs, the international financial institutions, such as the World Bank, which are, of course, at Davos. And what they say, remember, I mean, everybody's familiar with it. Our aim, the Fintech aim, is to give people the tools, the ordinary people, the tools by which to lift themselves out of poverty. Do you know that? You remember that? That's a famous line, isn't it? So if you use the economist's notion of activity, which means self-interest, get on, take responsibility for yourself, then actually there's agreement on this. These arguments look as though they're diametrically opposed, but there's a level at which they're pretty similar, pretty similar. So the human economy idea is meant to say, look, the people are doing things. It's just that with your Davos and Oxfam, it's with your spectacles, you cannot see it. The things that the people do for themselves are rendered invisible by this very powerful idea you've got of how to be active. Take responsibility for yourself. So what one needs to do, and of course anthropologists do it, is to go somewhere and observe what the people themselves are doing. That's okay. That's fine. The anthropologists have done that for a long time, right the way from the 100 years and more. Go to the Trobriand Islands off the north coast of Australia and tell the rest of the world, if they're interested, what the Trobriand Islanders do. Right. The trouble is there, what you're leaving out is the fact that the people at Davos are also part of the human economy. They may say that the economists or the IFI's discourse captures what they do. We take responsibility for ourselves. That's why we're at Davos, after all. But they're also part of the human economy. We can't caricature them either. So we need to do, it's not just anthropology studying down. This is a phrase the anthropologists will know. You're studying ordinary people. You also have to study up. You have to do both simultaneously. And that's very important because otherwise one tends to caricature the Davos crowd, as it were. So that's, I mean, I'm not going to go, I could go on a long time, but I mean, that in a way, we're saying you've got to study in the human economy. You have to realize that the people are not passive. It's just that what they do can't be seen by recognized by people like the ones who go to Davos. On the other hand, the Davos crowd themselves are not outside the human economy. Their models, the economists' models, Homo economicus, will not describe how the captains of industry, and that's captains of industry and the governments, we all know you can't generalize about a government, you can't talk about the state as if it's one homogeneous entity. Unpack it. Which parts of the state take which views? Not all corporations are oil corporations, for example. So one needs to bear that in mind. One needs to look, because we are looking all the time. If the people are active but what they're doing is not being seen, they have to look for allies. And those allies are going to be the people, or some of the people, who get represented at Davos, and then we need to understand them as well. Where are interests that overlap between ordinary people on the ground in Africa or wherever, and these people who appear to command the universe? Okay, so that's enough on the human economy. We can discuss it further. It's just giving you a taste of how we would approach, which many of you intuitively, of course, we're not claiming this is somehow dramatically different from what other people do, but it's a good idea to formalize it a bit and push it. We need to get together and push this line. The first conference. We've had 7 conferences. This program has gone on for 12 years. It's Keith Hart, the very distinguished economic anthropologist, has been part of it for 8 years. And its longevity, it has a lot to do with his intellectual input. And he really drove it. Although he wasn't here permanently, he visited every year for 8 years. So he'd just gone when we organized this first conference 4 years ago in Johannesburg. And I looked at what I'd said to the people coming to the first conference. And I wrote to them the following, which I think is worth repeating, because I want this conference to develop some of these ideas. I said there were 2 aims in 2018. The first is to bring some of the, and this was very diplomatic, remember, we didn't at that point, we didn't know any of the Fintech people in Africa particularly well, so we weren't going to offend them at the start. The first aim is to bring some of the foremost African and Africa-based innovators in this field together in order to highlight the obstacles they have overcome, the successes they have achieved to date, and their plans for the future. This aim, in short, is to showcase the extent and sophistication of innovation in the African continent in the broad field of digital finance. All very polite. The second aim is to bring these innovators into conversation with academics with a special interest in the social, political, and economic implications of the innovations in question. Most innovators are aware that the fact that innovations are technologically feasible does not guarantee that they will be socially beneficial. but they may not have the expertise to consider the wider implications of their technological prowess. Providing them with an opportunity to interact with academics who have undertaken research on these implications in various parts of the world is likely to be a useful exercise for all concerned. Now, very polite language, diplomatic. I was really struggling not to offend anybody. But I think it's not necessarily a bad starting point for this conference as well. But this conference is 4 years later than the first, and we might ask how we can extend the discussion into new areas, or at least make it more pointed. First step, I think we need to reflect a little bit as we go along on what we learned from the 2018 conference. It was a getting to know you exercise, and people were very polite to each other. We don't have to feel, I think, under the same pressure to be as polite to each other. Despite this, one saw hackles beginning to rise at some points, quickly smoothed over in the interests of conviviality. There were a couple of occasions when innovators and regulators began to get cross with the academics. When the latter, the academics, appeared to argue that some foundational innovations served no useful purpose at all. One example, the suggestion that was made by an academic, that mobile phones were easy to steal and that having money in a mobile wallet was a complete waste of time. And the person on the other side responded rather crossly to say, "Are you saying that people were never robbed of cash in their pockets? I mean, what's the problem here?" Academics became annoyed, on the other hand, when some innovators and entrepreneurs rehearsed the party line, as it were, about the ostensible benefits of financial inclusion and of the particular technology that underpinned their attempt, their own personal attempt to achieve this goal. I remember one presentation on blockchain and cryptocurrency, which was a fairly unsubtle paean of praise for its technological sophistication, which was bound, according to the speaker at the time, to address the ostensibly manifold shortcomings of cash and mobile money. But the academics were not yet in a position to go beyond the usual critiques of the discourse, claiming that it was nothing more than a cover for the intent to fleece the poor of the few resources they had, which is probably a rather negative approach to take. Yet there were some promising signs. Some of the innovators showed that they recognized that they needed to listen carefully to what people on the ground wanted and needed if their interventions were to be of genuine rather than pretend benefit. Many innovators expressed an interest in knowing more about what was happening on the ground so that they did not have to rely totally on the guidelines emerging from the financial inclusion discourse from the World Bank and its fellow travelers, which they began to see the discourse embodied the interested wisdom of parties who thought they knew what was good for the people better than the people themselves. Some, but not all, of the academics were in a position to give them, the innovators, useful information, showing that what people on the ground did for themselves was often guided by principles that differed from the assumptions the innovators made about supposedly universal motivations and supposedly universal understandings and uses of money. Sibel was particularly forthcoming in this regard, giving the innovators present a very useful preview of the argument of her book, that many Kenyans saw the main purpose of money as the creation of wealth in social relationships. In other words, to put the matter bluntly, Kenyans, or many Kenyans, not all of course, many Kenyans and many others around the world create wealth in this form, social relationships, by giving money away and receiving it, rather than by hoarding it, which is what the Davos idea always is. Take responsibility for yourself. Open a bank account, open a savings account, whatever the story may be. Okay, thus any new financial technology which did not facilitate wealth building through exchange in order to build networks of relationships, Sybil suggested politely, might well run into some resistance. Okay. Her argument, and that of others, was also that those who sought to introduce money in new forms should be aware that people on the ground would see benefit in new forms supplementing existing forms of money. rather than necessarily replacing them. I mean, that seems to be have become over the past few years, that's fairly common wisdom, although not entirely. Poor people, as has been said, need to juggle resources. And having money in a spread of forms, cash, mobile, even crypto, would open options for juggling to ordinary people. Okay. 4 years later, the current generation of human economy postdocs and doctoral fellows, here some of them sit, anyway, I've lost, here. The current generation of human economy postdocs and doctoral fellows are taking the issues further than we were able to 4 years ago. They are focusing more specifically now on researching the pros and cons of the different, rather than just condemning it out of hand, because this is some Davos discourse. Let's research the pros and cons of the different services offered by fintech entrepreneurs. Our treatment of digital lending goes beyond simply castigating the discourse in which these entrepreneurs seek to cloak what they are doing. How do digital loans, this is Eric's question, how do digital loans fit into the lives and circumstances of people who are differently located in Kenyan society? Not the people in the abstract. And how does understanding how people in these different circumstances, different positions in society, use digital credit, how does understanding that sharpen our commentary on the phenomenon in general, which I think is the next step of the question. Similar questions are being asked of variously positioned people's relationships with mobile money transfer services and personal insurance services as well. We need to get beyond the one-size-fits-all critique of fintech innovation and the discourse of financial inclusion. I think the fact that there have been recent signs that fintech innovators are now taking stock of their efforts and achievements over the years since 2008, so 14 years, very quick, means that we can deepen the conversation on which we embarked in 2018, if we are meeting each other halfway, as it were. And I actually cited Caribou Digital because I've been reading that series of articles that are produced by Jake and which raise important questions about the overconfidence with which they and others embarked on their fintech activities 15 or so years ago. Their new studies are suggesting the assistance that aimed to benefit the poor in Africa did not, in fact, and that's the familiar argument, did not, in fact, reach those right at the bottom of the pyramid, but rather a category of people in the middle of the pyramid, as it were. The obvious question that arises is, what do we do now? I mean, that is something that one can discuss, I think, profitably. Do we say that the middle is the best we can do? Huh? Or do we think again about how to reach the very poorest people on the continent? The fact that such a question is being raised is an obvious opening for a deeper conversation between innovators and academics, provided we avoid both easy optimism and easy condemnation. Okay. I've got a few minutes. We need to find a way to contemplate the possibility. I think this is important as well. We need to find a way to contemplate the possibility that there are limits to what one can achieve through the invention of new forms of money and new services to go with them. In this regard, I think we might need to go with one of the human economy's program's cardinal principles. Observe carefully, and I've mentioned it already, observe carefully what people on the ground are doing to address their challenges themselves. Ordinary people took a leading part in the development of mobile money themselves, as the paper by Sibel and me will suggest. And they did so because this invention served a common need for another channel of P2P transfers. Innovators, I would argue, you may disagree, innovators have yet to find another channel, fintech invention which flows as directly from what the people do for themselves. You're welcome to challenge me in due course. And they may wait a long time to do so, even if the innovators and the academics discuss what to do in the fintech field endlessly from now on. You may wait. We may all wait a long time for another mobile money P2P transfer type idea. Perhaps the people have moved on elsewhere. We have to take this possibility into account. The obvious example, their attempts to cross the Mediterranean and the Channel being a case in point. If you, if we, if I, if you were at the bottom of the pyramid in Africa, would you devote your efforts to finding another mobile money type solution to your predicament, or to forcing the Brits either to accommodate you in their country or to cough up the resources necessary to keep you at home? There's a whole discussion about the need for compensation for colonialism. Well, I'm afraid you can talk at Davos until you're blue in the face about this. They're going to say, no. Right? No. There's an anthropologist you probably know, who criticized Safaricom, saying they should devote part of their profit from the float, interest they earn from the mobile money, or the cash float behind them, backing the mobile money. You can imagine Safaricom turning around and saying, are you serious? We have to pay for colonialism? I mean, the people have to do this themselves. You're not going to talk Safaricom into doing this. The people have to do this themselves, and they are. They are crossing the channel in rickety boats. And they are saying the implication is either you let us in or you fund development in Africa to stop us coming. And that silly Priti Patel and Liz Truss, who says she supports Patel's argument, now fly them to Kigali. Maybe we're better than spending a lot of time worrying about the next mobile money, P2P. We should be taking on that issue. We need to think about that. Okay. Yet there are still promising avenues to pursue. Democratic money, or whatever you want to call it. In the HE project, Human Economy Project, we are sympathetic to the idea of community currencies and are trying to approach them in a constructive fashion by figuring out the problems that beset them as they go through successive stages of development. Some anthropologists have been highly critical, which is in many ways unfair, I think, especially when they're misinformed. What is encouraging about community currencies is that they're being developed, at least in Africa, by not-for-profit agencies. This does not mean that for-profit private businesses have no role whatever to play in the fight against poverty and lack of development in Africa. But it does open the possibility that they may indeed be better suited to providing services for the growing number of people who are not poor. Africa's business people deserve the same access to absolutely secure and quick means of international payment via cryptos and blockchain as their counterparts elsewhere, and there is value in providing such a service. There's a number of ideas that I've thrown out. Either you're at liberty to suggest better avenues. I'm sure you are all able to address all of these and to suggest better avenues for conversation than I have done. But that's at least a start. Thank you. No.
Okay. No, thank you. I think I need, this is the, okay. Okay, thank you. So my presentation will attempt to give some general framing, again, looking at the concept of human economy, talking about the concept of money in the human economy, and then as another way of reflecting back on the 2018 conference, I wanted to talk about digital payments in Kenya during and after the COVID-19 crisis as a way of reflecting on sort of trends and change in fintech in Africa more generally. So, yeah, I don't need to talk too much about our conference because I think John talked about it, except to say that it was really nice to converse with people who are not also academics and to be forced to be a little more general, a little more clear, and to get out of some of the well-worn grooves of argument and perspective that academics often have. So I know that this will be a really interesting conversation amongst, you know, people with very different orientations and perspectives. So I'm really looking forward to that. The conference showed that, you know, successful entrepreneurs had created new services, remittance pathways, and solutions in Africa, and we heard from many of them at that time. But we also heard some signs of warning, some warning call. In particular, there was a really wonderful keynote given by Trevor Manuel, who was former Minister of Finance here in South Africa for many years, and he warned about new divides that were being created, new concentrations of wealth and power, and consumer risks from unregulated apps. And as we can see, or you know, as we'll find out, since that time, you know, these warnings have become ever, you know, more present and dire, I think. So, you know, from 2018 to 2022, where does digital finance in Africa stand? Oh, I can see myself here. How has the context changed, and why is the human economy approach that John has articulated still important? So perhaps first I should say a few words about money. The concept of money is at the center of the human economy program and the human economy approach, which is a goal to put people, their thoughts, actions, and lives first, according to Keith Hart in his 2010 manifesto. And, you know, money is an interesting concept because it's always backgrounded in, you know, all of our discussions, and yet we often don't bring some of those theories of money that are implicit in our perspectives, you know, to the forefront, even at a conference like this one. In fact, maybe even especially at a conference like this one. So the mystery of money in data who have a lot of power, like politicians and governments and bankers, are talking about bringing inflation under control as if it were a kind of abstract force that is outside of their hands. The source of money's value often becomes obscured for us, and it seems like a mysterious force. Some interesting polls have been taken around this topic. In the United States, sorry, I can't really see the number, but a lot of people don't know where money comes from. The majority of people in the United States thinks that the government prints money and that that's where the value of money comes from. But even among academics, it's a huge debate as to why money has value and why it has so much control over us, right? And yet we are the people who have created money. So Marcel Mauss grappled directly with the mystery of money by looking at ethnographic cases from different cultures all over the world. Forms of money varied greatly in all of the cases he looked at, but money often had a religious or a magical character. And for him, this religious or magical force was what made money a social fact, an institution based on a common faith or a common bond in society. So money had value because it was collective and because people had faith in each other and faith in the institution that they had created. So another person that I think is really, really important when it comes to some of these implicit theories of money that we might be bringing to a conference like this one might be Jeffrey Ingham. And like Mauss, he also notes that money creates a social bond, which he calls a common infrastructure, a social technology, or he uses the term infrastructural power. So he argues that everyday people have infrastructural power with money, as it is a public good for pursuing the collective welfare. But he also says that money has another nature. It has another character. It can also be, often at the same time, a weapon, a means of control and power, thinking of taxes, wars, debt. Even as we know as anthropologists that even in the context of a household, money can create relationships of power and friction and conflict. So he ends up by saying that money is a struggle for value. It's not really a fixed value. It's a struggle for access and a struggle for power amongst differently placed people within a society. So what does that have to do with the human economy? Well, I think we can ask. If in the human economy we're looking at everyday people, what economy means to them, and we're trying to center their activity and their forms of value, we can ask what happens to the agency of people as it encounters large and complex systems that also struggle to define the meaning of money, and how does that struggle for value play out? So now to kind of take that perspective and use it to reflect backwards on the 2018 conference and some of the changes that have been happening in African fintech, we can look back at the period of the early 2000s, the period of techno-optimism. People were talking about leapfrogging, looking at innovation from below, information and communication technologies for development, trying to build common infrastructures for information, finance, e-commerce, thinking about laying down infrastructures for broadband internet in Africa, building innovation hubs. And one of my favorite quotes comes from Donald Kaberuka, president of the African Development Bank Group, who said, you know, with all of this technology, Africa is going to leave a painful past behind. We used to be a scar in the conscience of the world, but we're soon to be the most exciting continent on the planet. So here is an example of tech hubs. This is the Silicon Savannah that I drove by this summer, and it was really, really active. We saw hundreds of workers coming into work in the morning. Sort of the idea is to build innovation hubs that are hooked into local realities and local problems, and problem solving not from above, but from the people who understand the local setting. Okay, so Kenya, of course, a lot of my talk will be about Kenya. It's the only place I'm really familiar enough with to give a talk, so I apologize about that. It is kind of the classic mobile money success story. It scaled rapidly, and large numbers of households are hooked in some way to circulations of value using digital payments in Kenya. It's a great example, at least initially, of Ingham's concept of money as a social technology, as a human infrastructure. And from a human economy point of view, we need to understand how people themselves are building that human infrastructure. What are the redistributive goals of, say, a grandmother? And, you know, I'm sorry about the slide because the remittance arrows are for some reason not showing up there too well. But if you look at this slide, which some of you can't see, the graph is a network map showing the directionality and the flow of remittances connecting a family, in this case a grandmother, who has a bridge, builds a bridge from one set of her kin to another set of her kin. So what are the redistributive goals of grandmothers and really everyday people who are using M-Pesa remittances? So money has become a really important social infrastructure online in Kenya. Money plays a huge role in social media. If you look at Kenyans on Twitter or other aspects of digital culture in Kenya, money is very important. Fundraising is ubiquitous. Money sharing is ubiquitous. Money is communication, and it's taken on rich new symbolic meanings. There's a wonderful book by Nanjala Nyabola about this called Digital Democracy, Analog Politics, which is a wonderful book. On the other hand, though, that other side of the nature of money has yet to be grappled with. Are these distributive networks pathways to agency or value, and for whom? How materially rich are these networks really? Who is benefiting? And what are the costs of participation, of gaining access into these networks? Who's being left out? The COVID emergency was about to provide some disturbing answers, revealing some of the divides and some of the costs of participation in these new circulations of money. So COVID and digital payments. COVID was a huge setback for the agenda around techno development in Africa. I think a lot of people can agree about that. Because of lockdowns, because of capital flight, foreign capital flight from Africa, Kenya experienced an enormous increase in poverty and food insecurity. A year later, 5% of more than 5% of Kenya's population had been plunged into poverty, according to the World Bank. Financial Sector Deepening Kenya, which is an NGO, has done a bunch of surveys, started doing surveys of things like financial health, and found that food insecurity, poor financial health really increased during the pandemic. In August 2020, 30% of Kenyans missed between 3 and 5 meals a week. And I'm not sure how many meals are considered normal, but a lot of Kenyans would eat 2 meals a week and consider that normal, I believe. So, these are cultural questions we have to ask, but that's a lot of people missing a lot of meals. Okay, so shortly after the first case of COVID-19 was announced in Kenya, President Kenyatta initiated an edict which, in addition to a large number of interventions such as lockdowns, encouraged people to pay digitally and to start using digital payments instead of cash to curb the spread of the coronavirus. And at that time, we still didn't know a lot about where it came from, and the idea that it could be on various surfaces was, unfortunately, one of the initial ideas. Okay, so in addition to kind of pushing and recommending using digital payments, there was a reduction in fees across the board. So fees for small remittances of, say, 1,000 shillings or less, fees to move money digitally from your phone to your bank account. Those fees are reduced or eliminated. And as a result, over the past year, over that year from 2020 to 2021, there was unprecedented growth in the use of digital payments. That includes cash-out transactions, bank-to-phone transactions, and especially the use of merchant payments or lipa na M-Pesa. I don't have a lot of the statistics here, but I can show you the FSD report. And the huge rise in merchant payments, I think, is pretty significant too, because this had been kind of the sticking point for closing the loop, was encouraging people to pay for things, at grocery stores using digital money. So there was a big increase in the use of lipa na M-Pesa. Safaricom also created a new app for merchants in June 2020. There were 100,000 downloads in the first 3 months, which is almost half the total number of merchant tills in Kenya. So the number of active merchants using lipa na M-Pesa increased 43%. The value of transactions increased. And this is what's really interesting to me. Despite the removal of fees for transactions under 1,000 shillings, per remittance, revenue actually increased 24%, Safaricom's revenue. So, what happened, of course, at the end of 2020 is that this period where there were no fees was ended, and all the fees were reimposed. Although you have to wonder why, because they actually made more money during this period. So I'm not sure what happened, but it's interesting to think about. Okay, so emergencies fast forward historical processes and create conditions where, social change might happen more easily, or people who are committed to certain forms of social change might take action to enable that change in a way that they might not during a normal time. Okay, so what will happen to the bridges to cash? Interestingly, according to the report, agents are making less money in Kenya than ever before. And that's a consequence of the increased digitization. So what will happen to these bridges to cash that are so important in connecting the digital and the cash money circulations? One viral video was really widely shared in Kenya around this time. There was an M-Pesa agent named Danson Wanjohi in Kirinyaga who devised this really ingenious and amazing invention to sanitize money. So, I don't have the video here, but it's very funny if you want to look at it. He became a social media star overnight by devising, it's a kind of in between two rollers, you insert your cash in there, and there's a little squeeze bottle in there that, sanitizes your cash and purifies your cash. So I think that's a very good example of the agency of everyday people and the agency of the agents, right, who maintain that channel, who prevent that loop from closing, so to speak, and try to maintain the connection that people have to cash money. And when people are socially distant, money brought us together. There was an enormous rise in kind of collective money sending and concern for people who are suffering. Mchanga, the fundraising site from Kenya, had a very big year during the lockdown. There were also very important social entrepreneurs like Ms. Jafar here, who took it upon herself to raise money for people who were suffering without food during the lockdown. So, and this was not just a Kenyan thing, this was a global thing. As Viviana Zalazer writes in the New York Times, the COVID was a time of collective trauma. Money became a tangible social connector, bridging the physical gap, and again, providing that social infrastructure for the common good that is one of the two important dimensions of money. Interestingly, Kenya is the only African country where international remittances increased during 2020, which I think is really interesting. Okay. So, at the same time that we see these shifts towards greater use of digital payments, we notice a lot of other broad changes going on in Kenyan society that were, again, pushed forward by the pandemic, but also a result of other much longer-term changes going on in Kenyan society and in the Kenyan economy. FSD has a new study of financial health and livelihoods. A lot of that has to do with the pandemic shocks, but there are other longer-term changes involved. You can see how much Kenyans' financial health has decreased. So in 2016, 40% of Kenyans had relatively high financial health. What does financial health mean? There is an index there. It means, how often are you eating? It means, can you raise money for an emergency? And do you have money for things like education? Do you have money for things not just everyday consumption, but are you able to save for the future, save to educate your children? So in 2016, 40% of Kenyans were financially healthy, and in 2021, only 15% of Kenyans are financially healthy. This is in spite of being the setting for the mobile money revolution and the fintech revolution in Africa. So we can ask about the disconnect. If this story of M-Pesa and fintech is, such a success, why is it that we see declining economic health in Kenya? So de-agriculturalization, the loss of a farming way of life, is another momentous change going on, not just in Kenya, but throughout sub-Saharan Africa. One of the most common livelihoods in Kenya before, in the early part of this period, 2016, was farming, and we see that there is a dramatic loss of a farming way of life. More and more people trying to pick up casual work and other ways of making money. In Western Kenya, where I work, the farms have become very, very small because, when you have children, every child gets a small piece of your farm. And, the plots keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller, of course. rising prices, consumer prices have risen dramatically. People are also earning less money, and we have rising amounts of digital debt and inability to repay. I'm not going to talk too much about those statistics because I'm sure it will be a theme in the later papers, but it's definitely something that is in the financial report as well. And of course, how are people surviving? You know, they're going back to that social infrastructure. They're going back to their social networks. And in the middle graph, it's kind of hard to see, but you know, the question asks, how did you deal with these shocks? How did you deal with rising living costs? You know, did you cut back expenses? Did you rely on remittances from your friends and family? And it's a little bit hard to see, but getting remittances from your social network was one of the most common means through which people survived these shocks. So there's a sense that the social network is, you know, not only the sustenance and the livelihoods for people, but you can also ask, how much can these social networks really bear? How much strain can they really bear? And is this really sort of what a human economy should be all about? So in futures, plans to infrastructure, food, education, and health, Web3, artists, there are artists in Nairobi who are trying to make money with NFTs, which I think is really, really cool. So that's the optimism, the techno-optimism, but I wonder if the moment for this conference isn't really the techno-optimism that was still there in 2018, although maybe a little bit fading. But maybe the moment now is techno-pessimism. Among the academics, there's a lot of techno-pessimism. Numerous work and books. The best-selling book by Shoshana Zuboff, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, is a really chilling read. Beyond just the problems that Fintech has, you know, devising apps with relevance, affordability, trust, there are broader issues: digital debt, digital surveillance, even data colonialism is when platforms and apps capture data from our intimate lives, transform that information into data, then enable new apps and products that sell our lives back to us, according to Nick Coldry in the book, The Cost of Connection. Okay. So I hate to end on such a pessimistic note, but I think that there's still hope there. You know, the human economy approach will show, and a lot of the papers will show, that that last mile of the human infrastructure and the age of agency of people is still really, really important. And I think we'll find examples of the way that the people are not powerless in the world of fintech in Africa. Or I hope we will. Or I think we can ask the question, will we? Okay, thank you.
I'm not sure whether tea is ready because it's 10:02. We've done extremely quickly. So we take a couple of questions then until tea is ready.
Sorry, I just wanted to add to the comment on
Sorry, who's the question aimed at?
Sorry?
Who's the question aimed at? Who is it aimed at?
No, it's just a comment.
Just a comment,
Yeah,
okay.
Just a comment on
Fine.
How come M-Pesa made more money of revenues when the transaction fee was cut. You know, I just thought it would be good to just, you know, say my view. I think it was a network effect, you know, so when you lower the transaction fees, you know, more people come on board. Even the people who are not using M-Pesa started using their products. And I think as a result, you know, there was a network effect that, you know, came on board, and, you know, eventually those people started using other products beyond M-Pesa. And so basically where there was, you know, only certain people using M-Shwari, now they had more people saving with them. So I think with that effect, you know, eventually it was gonna be, you know, a revenue effect in the end, and I think that's what really happened there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, it's interesting.
I was fascinated
Shout.
Fascinated by your concept of, I think I can speak loud. Oh, okay. Is it on? Yeah. I wanted to just also use the COVID-19 example in Zimbabwe to also relate it to your idea of human infrastructure, because it made mobilities of even resources, of money, of people very difficult. But Zimbabwe is a country that had a very huge and growing diaspora. People had to find ways of transferring money in spite of the fact that it was very difficult for people to go to these mobile money agents to go and collect the money. So human relationships became very central with regards to people wanting to use money in South Africa, but having the money in Zimbabwe, and then someone pays the money here, and the relative gets the equivalent of that money in Zimbabwe. I think it's something that is fascinating, which speaks to the agency, but also the idea of humans as infrastructure in terms of the affordances that their agency allows in the transfer of money and the socialities that comes with it. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks a lot for the two talks. I just wanted to maybe raise some concerns about the direction of the human economy approach in terms of how we deal with interlocutors, because I think there is a strong tendency to, I don't want to say romanticize, but there is a strong tendency to look at creative solutions to problems and such things. On the one hand, there is also something that many people used to it's a potential of exploitation when these things are then marketed and exploited by actors who have the finances. But on the other hand, it also kind of limits an understanding of how, for example, in a place like Kenya, and I think people may disagree or agree, I don't know, we can discuss it, but money has not only become a means of survival, but almost taken over, it's become the only thing where people get social validation from. And there is no alternative in terms of education or in terms of how people are educated, that they can criticize that rampant materialism, which I think is a huge problem in terms of how people deal with shocks. Like, for example, in the COVID case, when you have somebody like a middle class, maybe Nairobian, half of the money goes to pay for a car. There's a lot of peer pressure to show off success. And that person is also responsible for a lot of relatives, both in the rural and urban area. And there is no, at least not that I know of, almost no critical discourse on alternative forms of what the economy is, or critiques of capitalism or anything like that.
In Kenya, you mean?
In Kenya.
Do you want me to respond? Or, no, carry it. Sorry, I can afterwards, if there are more.
Yeah, well, thank you for two really interesting presentations. I hope everyone can hear me. All right, so I had a question concerning where we find mobile money being used. And I'm not exactly sure about the context of Kenya, but certainly in the context of Zimbabwe, it's at least to me, I stand corrected here, it's probably a function of a collapsing financial system. So in a context where banks have really collapsed, ATMs no longer dispense cash, you cannot go to a bank to borrow money, either to buy a car or to have a mortgage or whatever. That's the context in which you find mobile money particularly becoming successful. I think you can say something about Kenya, but certainly in Zimbabwe, in Lesotho, you find those kinds of developments. So I'm wondering to what extent, I do see the sort of human economy element in the ways in which people adapt those mobile money platforms to utilize them. But to what extent is it not big businessmen such as Strive Masiwa taking an opportunity to become a tech billionaire by utilizing these kinds of opportunities, and really how useful are they sustainable over time?
Can I respond? Shall I respond to that? The way we've used the human economy, we've never said it's nice. The starting point for Keith Hart and me is the idea that the rationale offered by Davos, that was the example I took, right? Look after yourself first, and then we'll let you on board. That is caricaturing what people on the ground do, right? They are not Homo economicus. Not being Homo economicus does not mean kumbaya. It does not mean, you know, we all got to sing together. It means I can steal from you too. That's part of the human economy. And we cannot forget, and unfortunately, that you've got to deal with. And the other thing, in the 1980s, I worked in one of the Bantustans of that time, Kwakwa, you may know it. Well, because you've been down in the Free State. It's a little area next to Lesotho, which is a little area in itself. But Kwakwa is even smaller. I mean, it is at the time when I was there, it was 20 kilometers by 20. And the state relocated. It was mass forced relocation from Free State farms as they mechanized harvesting of maize. People were told, there's your home. There's your homeland. Go. The place, by the time I got there, had 500,000 people in it. Now it has close to 1 million, and it's not much bigger. Now, the thing we found out there was, and that's the point you're trying to make, I think. You can have all the networks you like. But if you have absolutely nothing, there was a labor recruitment system designed for 20,000 people that had been there, and suddenly it was trying to deal with 500,000 people. When I arrived there for the very first time, I thought I was dead. Because as I parked my car with the student with me, 10,000 guys ran towards the car. I said to the student, I don't know what we've done, but I think this is it. And I wound down the window an inch, and one of them shoved his passbook, Dompas, and said, have you got a job? And it was all these guys. Now, under those circumstances, all talk about kumbaya and looking after each other. One of my colleagues and I wrote a paper called The End of Kinship, which was published in Africa. So the human economy is not necessarily nice, but it's here. Most people do, including, and that's what I was saying, most people, including the Davos crowd, do not behave like the economists tell us. And Ronald Coase was right when he said economics has unfortunately become a technique for managing the world in the interests of the Davos crowd. That's it. So there's a limit to what the human economy is going to do. I mean, it's not as if we cannot say, we've got to get beyond this idea that it's always a safety net and people are able to adapt. They can't. You get beyond that point. It's tea. Would you like to? Sorry, John. Okay. It's tea. Is this one empty?
Yeah.
Just to give everybody a couple of minutes. Yeah.
Is there still people out there? Okay, just wait 1 second if you wouldn't mind.
So welcome back, everyone. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Ivan Small, Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Houston. Dr. Small is a specialist in international remittances and in Vietnam. He's the author of 2 books, Currencies of Imagination, and together with Phil Maurer and Smokey Musaraj, the book Money at the Margins.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, well, thank you, John and Sibel, for inviting me to this. It's always a pleasure to have this opportunity to compare and share stories across disciplines, across regions, across practices about what we're observing with changes to financial infrastructures and the social processes that accompany those. And then secondly, I just wanted to apologize. I had a terrible 24-hour flight yesterday that got delayed in various places, and in the process I didn't get much sleep and lost my voice. But I do know we're spending the next 5 days together, so I promptly tested myself for COVID, so not to worry. But my voice is a little bit off, so I hope that this presentation conveys okay. So I'm an anthropologist, and there's a lot of discussion in anthropology about the infrastructural turn in the social sciences. And the infrastructural turn recognizes the material, technological, and expert knowledge productions that transcend borders. These systemic developments, in turn, affect local cultural productions and transformations. These demand a rethinking of how and where we conduct ethnographic research across field sites and how we attend to their linkages. So in today's presentation, I will consider financialization of at a global infrastructural scale and my goal is to show how transformations in Fintech conceptualizations of money and digital mobile money in particular are shaping practices of financializing migrant remittances across the global south, from Africa to Southeast Asia. And Sibel, I found your discussion of concepts and theories of money quite useful earlier. It's something I'd like to pick up on because I think it's quite interesting that you mentioned Marcel Mauss and his conceptualizations of money as magical and religious. And it's interesting that we don't often pick up on that side of Mauss's work. It's often his work on the gift, and the gift is kind of romanticized as something that's in opposition to the utilitarian, value of money. So I'd love to kind of pick up on that in our discussion today as well. So I'm going to demonstrate how new monetary practices and ecologies are in turn shaping and shaped by business and policy strategies led by private and public stakeholders in the global north that are intended to replicate models for application across the global south. And so I start my presentation with a trip to Kenya that I took in 2013, nearly 10 years ago. And at that time, I was in Nairobi attending the Mobile Money for the Unbanked workshop organized by the Global System for Mobile Communications Association, or GSMA. This included representatives from a range of international organizations, startup tech companies, government central banks, and telecommunications operators. At the conference, there was an anti-cash and pro-digital money sentiment among the participants who came from around the world. So 2013 was halfway through the first decade of mobile money. And the event was held in Kenya in part to highlight and model the technological and regulatory success of M-Pesa. As this audience is well aware, M-Pesa was originally a type of P2P remittance service through which even those without bank accounts could use their mobile phones to deposit, transfer, and withdraw value for a small fee. Run by Kenya's Safaricom, M-Pesa demonstrated the benefits of government-industry cooperation in that it allowed users to bypass banks by enabling telecommunication firms to cash in and cash out money. Introduced in 2007, Safaricom's M-Pesa-related services have since grown to include a range of other offerings, from loans to payments, tied to an emerging industry goal of never having to cash out one's original monetary deposit. The value stored in the mobile money account can be connected to services to pay electricity bills, buy groceries or insurance, apply for microloans, or even play games. So by promoting a cashless ecology, companies intended to reduce the burden of liquidity shortfalls that result when the majority of deposits are often in cities and withdrawals are often in the countryside. They, of course, also profit from the transfer and payment service fees. So from a development practitioner perspective, mobile money systems and expanding an ecology of interlinked and interoperable services effectively function as a financialization on-ramp to banking. The celebration of M-Pesa at the Nairobi Unbanked Workshop and others reveals a shifting international policy landscape when it comes to remittances. Remittances, which are those ubiquitous monies sent by migrants, have captured the poverty-alleviating imaginations of a generation of development economists. In the process, private value transfers have in many ways become public goods. Development discourses surrounding remittances and migration often become a governance process of responsible subject making. So remittances as an issue of development intervention has shifted over the last generation. And especially during the pandemic when international border crossing was disrupted, as Sibel pointed to today. This includes a turn in policy attention from international to domestic remittances. Along with this has been increased attention to the emergence of digital money as a mode of remittance transfer and a technological blueprint for replication. Since the early 2000s, countless studies have enthusiastically highlighted and refined their calculations of the quantities of informal aid sent by migrants to their home countries. The World Bank estimates that over $600 billion cross international borders each year in migrant transfers. And yet, while remittances have become visible as a tangible action issue for policymakers, in other ways they are also becoming less so. For one, attention to the development potential for remittances is increasingly turning towards domestic transfers, which, due to the internal state nature of their primarily urban to rural flows, cannot be as easily tracked. In Vietnam, where I conduct much of my ethnographic fieldwork, surveys have revealed that while international remittances reach a little less than 10% of households, actually well over 80% of households receive some form of domestic remittance. So in a domestic framework, financial, but also, as I want to emphasize in today's presentation, material value transfers are more easily portable within state borders. They also do not face the regulatory scrutiny of international remittances, where fears of money laundering and terrorist financing have dominated global financial policies and set up a variety of barriers to transfers. So one only has to observe the long-distance buses across many countries in the global south, whether in Vietnam or Kenya or Mexico, where package delivery frequently coincides with the passenger transportation business as incentives. Frequently they go together. Migrants returning from the country carry material goods that they purchased in the city. These range from water faucets and pots and pans to televisions, microwaves, generators, even motorcycles as forms of material value that can be put to practical use or reconverted to financial value. Arbitrage of this kind is a common form of material remittance flow across domestic corridors. As an anthropologist who has studied both remittances and transportation in different contexts, this intersection of the two issues has been particularly intriguing for me to follow. As one man transporting goods from the city of Da Nang in Vietnam to his central coastal hometown explained to me during a discussion in 2017, quote, "My family needs these products from the city, so it is better to buy and carry them with me rather than just bringing cash when I return home," unquote. So despite the obvious and widespread material value transfer practices by migrants from cities to the country, it has been the visibility and by extension the assumed risk of cash that has received the most attention from the financial inclusion world. This reveals what anthropologist James Ferguson might describe as a kind of development problem that requires a solution that they are there to provide. It is precisely the cash risk issue where a development intervention can be made, and this is where financial inclusion advocates have come to embrace, in particular, the cashless mantra. So the cashless financial technology nexus has been widespread in development circles for some time, in the last decade and a half focusing on the potentials of the cellular phone. In 2008, development economist Jeffrey Sachs identified the cell phone as the single most transformative technology for development. In the years since then, mobile phone-based money, or MM, has been a central focus for development practitioners seeking cashless transfer solutions. The Better Than Cash Alliance, based out of the United Nations in New York, defines itself as a partnership of governments, companies, and international organizations that accelerates the transition from cash to digital payments in order to reduce poverty and drive inclusive growth. An analysis of its partners reveals a unique assortment of bedfellows, including nonprofits and foundations such as the Gates Foundation, the Omidyar Network, which is a self-styled philanthropic investment firm, and for-profit companies such as MasterCard and Visa. Their diverse interests have all come in various ways to collude around developing a cashless ecology in the form of mobile money in which value moves within a contained payment ecosystem so as to ideally never have to be cashed out in material form. So ecologies of cashlessness came up frequently in various industry, tech, and development policy discussions that I participated in as a global researcher of mobile money beginning in 2012, ranging from Nairobi to Singapore to New York and Washington. What are the contours of this cashless ecosystem, and why has it found support across such a diverse group of nonprofit and for-profit stakeholders when it comes to remittances? Mobile money as a primary model of cashlessness in the Global South appears to hold promise as an effective and accessible tool of financial inclusion for the poor, as we all well know. However, it also reveals that the poor have always, in fact, managed diverse forms of value, and that there is a market to be tapped if one looks to the many other ways the traditionally financially excluded are also economic actors in their own right. For this reason, industry designers, government regulators, and development practitioners have all been interested in learning more about the needs of the largely unbanked, the so-called bottom billion in financial inclusion speak, and how and why uptake and participation in mobile money ecologies occur. As one industry representative put it at a Mobile Money for Development conference in New York in 2014, "We have the technology, but we need to stoop down and meet our customers, get them to use our mobile wallets, and then connect everything to them so that they never cash out. We're on a long path towards total global interoperability." So this emerging interoperable infrastructure of cashlessness has practical and sociocultural consequences among those stooped down to users of mobile money services. Much of the industry and development research that has been done on mobile money approach their inquiries from a user uptake approach. Mobile money, similar to the remittances that they technically channel, has become a silver bullet solution to poverty and urban-rural inequalities and mobilities for the majority of applied researchers studying the potentials for cashless features in the Global South. Put the tool of the mobile phone and the technology to transfer, save, and borrow digital value through it in the hands of the poor, and their lives will transform. So it goes. And this is assumed to be true whether mobile money operates in Cameroon or Cambodia. And yet, a field of para-ethnographic social science research collaborations investigating how people manage mobile money systems, including the ways they intersect and overlap with other modes of saving, borrowing, and payment, is showing us that mobile money as a straightforward financial inclusion technology is rather complex. Local repertoires of value management shape the ways users relate to the introduction of technologies and systems designed to promote cash-light or cashless societies. In turn, the introduction of dematerialized money can affect sociocultural notions of value and exchange, which may have unintended impacts. Mobile money has been heralded for its promises of financial inclusion and the allure of the cashless horizon, but in actuality, its uptake has been quite uneven across different countries, regions, and communities. So I turn my attention for the rest of my remarks from Africa to Asia. Southeast Asia is a region of the Global South where cashless remittance technologies are actively being promoted. Mobile money has been widespread since the mid-2000s in the Philippines, actually even earlier than M-Pesa, with GCash, and is being explored in other countries such as Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, and Vietnam. The Vietnam Bank for Social Policies, in partnership with MasterCard and the Asia Foundation, ran a feasibility study and implemented a pilot project for mobile banking back in 2014, clarifying the technological and banking potential but remaining vague on the specifics of regulatory support. Other exploratory efforts have followed, but nothing has sustained. In November 2021, a new 2-year pilot was introduced with a cautious $400 monthly transfer allowance limit, reflecting a general start and stop and wait and see approach to mobile money in Vietnam. Vietnam's slow embrace of mobile money does not reflect the kind of rapid adoption and expansion enthusiastically envisioned at the Mobile Money for the Unbanked workshop that I first described. In places like Vietnam, then, we see the effective limits of modeling. Kenya's M-Pesa success story is, after all, more than a technological innovation requiring customer appeal. It is also a regulatory alliance between central banks and telecommunications companies. This particular arrangement that made M-Pesa successful in Kenya limits its replicability in other places, especially given the international frameworks such as the Financial Action Task Force that pressure central banks to maintain strict oversight over money laundering. While the range of payment options within mobile value ecosystems is expanding to Vietnam, from games to bills and transport payment, and companies like Momo and Vitel have been anticipating mobile money and attempting to register potential users, in the end, there has not been a consistent or easy way to cash out such credit person to person without a bank account. And this, of course, remains a barrier in a country where more than half the population remains unbanked. This is despite Vietnam's goal to arrive at a digital and banked economy by this decade. So the shift in attention from international to domestic remittances has brought new challenges for development practitioners and policymakers' capacities to visualize and manage the contours of their moving poverty reduction target. Domestic remittances are more difficult to track than international ones, and furthermore can take a broader and more creative variety of material forms. In the drive to visualize the new focus of the remittance landscape as it relates to urban-rural transfers, analysts tend to overlook what is most immediate. Those very material practices in which migrants arbitrage and transport material value on a bus or a train or a truck. The risk of transporting physical cash from one locale to another is real, but has also been long recognized by migrants. As I have suggested, transporting material goods is itself an agental, cashless solution to remittance transfers. When it comes to this commonplace practice, of course, there is not much that development practitioners can contribute and little money to be made by the financial industry that it bypasses. Financial inclusion advocates have turned instead to what they can more easily and quantitatively grasp and value as a concept to money, and then dressed it up with what they can add, technology. They tend to downplay the more challenging political and regulatory accompaniments that are actually required to make such transfer systems work. This also extends. Oops. This also extends to recent attempts to introduce blockchain technology as yet another solution to easing remittance transfers. But where regulatory ambivalence also persists and uptake features remain ever imminent but never fully arrived. Again, I really apologize about losing my voice here. So across fintech futurisms, remittances have been a reforming target of intervention as banks, money transfer operators, the telecommunications industry, INGOs, and other stakeholders attempt to ironically cash in on and aid the until recently invisible unbanked bottom billion. As the informal and formal economic sectors become increasingly merged and visualized, cashless fintech is the latest mantra promoted by a new constellation of intermediaries who seek to track, govern, and extract value from migrants. While mobile and digital money undoubtedly offer some benefits for domestic migrants seeking to remit, one must also be cognizant of the interests of the financialization stakeholders promoting it as a silver bullet solution. This is especially the case when there is growing proof that the bullet is not always shiny silver, nor the only solution. So the point that I would end on with this audience is how do we remind ourselves to attend to the ethnographic and the unexpected in our own research? The idea of the human economy is to attend to the embeddedness of social practices in the economic. As the mission statement of the Human Economy Program states, the search for a more human economy must begin by analyzing what people actually do, how they do or do not insert themselves into an economy that is organized by impersonal models which all too often fail to notice or give any weight to people's everyday attempts to secure their own sustenance and improvement. The origins of mobile money came from observing and building on value transfer practices by migrants, in this case, the creative arbitrage of airtime. At the time, this was very much a surprise finding, what the anthropologist Marilyn Strathern might call an ethnographic moment that redirects attention away and beyond what you're expecting to find in your fieldwork. Now that mobile money has been institutionalized, much of the analytical emphasis has been on technological uptake, modeling, and expansion, even if this may all be plateauing, according to a recent report by the UN Capital Development Fund. If we focus too much on mobile money as a global solution to remittance and payment needs of the poor, we may also risk forgetting to keep our eyes open to the many other ways that migrants locally engage with bodily, financial, and material mobility, including, as I mentioned, the literal carrying of things on buses, as well as the many other ways where there are good reasons for migrants avoiding oversight and rent seeking. So what can we further learn about migrant needs and how to support the solutions that we have come up with if we take the time to observe from a standpoint of ethnographic inquiry rather than solution provision? There may be connections between these two approaches, and indeed, usually there are. But sometimes there may not be. A human economy approach to financial inclusion would then be one that leaves open the possibilities of ethnographic exploration, openness to the unexpected, and continues to primarily attend to what people do in different places. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ivan. So I think now we have time for discussion, if I'm not mistaken. And so we had just begun a discussion that we cut off. So that was something we should work on next time. We should make sure that we should just make sure that we time it right. So yeah, because we had interesting very interesting questions that we did not answer, and then a lot of things that generated over tea as well. So maybe, I don't know where the microphones are, but maybe we could somehow get back into that. I know that Mario's question had no answer. Tinashe's question had no answer. would someone like to start us up again, maybe, and we'll kind of loop back into the open issues that we had? Questions? Yeah.
So Maria and Tinashe then, since you said they weren't answered,
I feel that they might be sitting here feeling very unsatisfied. I just want to make sure that all of our customers are satisfied, but I could be wrong.
well, get them to rephrase the question.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I tried to rephrase it to John a bit earlier, but let me just look at where I had written it. I was just saying that when we look at the case, particularly of Zimbabwe, and I was just speaking to some colleagues over the coffee break who were telling me about the Kenyan context. And I was saying in the context of Zimbabwe, for example, isn't it just a case of techpreneurs identifying a vent for surplus where there's a collapsing financial system, where banks are not really operating? And in that context, these products that they're offering to the market, to what extent are they really coming from those people themselves? I think the last presentation really just went a long way in demonstrating some of these points, which I thought was really fascinating. But in any case, there are certain things missing there. To what extent is the community or are communities involved in putting together these infrastructures? And I suppose maybe I'll ask a second question to, emerging from this presentation, hopefully it links, and it has to do with I don't know if it's a tension or a competition between commercial banks and these telecom companies. Because, to give the example of Zimbabwe again, EcoCash and EcoNet really thrive in a context where banks don't function very well. But you come to South Africa, and as I was saying earlier, FNB is launching a whole vast of products. I watched them on television yesterday, and they were there for almost 3-4 hours, just launching this variety of products. But these products use cell phones, whatever network they are. So I'm curious to know whether in the case of EcoNet or in the case of, what is it called, the one in Kenya? No, not M-Pesa as such, but the provider. Safaricom, yes, thank you. In the case of Safaricom and EcoNet, they seem to have a big market share in terms of, perhaps I could call it telebanking, I don't know. But what does that tension or that competition do in specific context? I don't know if that question is,
Okay. Yeah, sure. Jonathan, go ahead. Yeah.
It's on. I might be able to, I was going to make a comment, but actually it lines up a little bit with that question, which is I'm wondering if even in the first few sessions we've had today, we have, we're rotating around several big related but not synonymous concepts, right? Where your talk was about mobile money in particular, around the kind of the archetype of M-Pesa and how it fits or doesn't fit in these other situations. And I think that there is a discourse around mobile money. Maybe it's better than cash. You hear that there's a whole organization and a whole conference you can go to about how mobile money is better than cash. There is a discourse about financial inclusion, which is not the same as mobile money necessarily. And there are actually many ways of using cell phones to help extend financial inclusion that may or may not look like M-Pesa, right? So there are all the bank-led models in certain countries where maybe it's because of the strength of the banks or maybe it's because of the regulatory environment. Bank-led models exceed the telco-led models as the way to get payments and transfer functionality at a minimum to more people. And there's a discourse about that. There's a financial inclusion discourse. And yet, when we started the day, John, your first comments were about the fintech discourse. And there is a fintech community, some of which is sort of trying to solve problems or capture markets, depending on your frame, for relatively resource-constrained people in the developing world. Some fintech has nothing to do with development or financial inclusion at all. And there's a lot of contestation around what I think the fintech discourse is too. But one thing that's interesting and challenging for us as we're trying to make sense of all this is that some of the fintech models that are neither bank-led nor telco-led are actually playing out now in every country on earth, right? And they're going over the top or around or behind or whatever, and other people who are better industry analysts than me will know exactly what's going on. But there's this financial inclusion to fintech nexus that is getting us into a situation where I think there's contested narratives around what's actually happening, and nobody can tell what the future holds for Safaricom in particular, or M-Pesa in particular. But this notion of the digitalization of money is broader than M-Pesa, and it's even broader than mobile money. And it leads to all sorts of questions for us right now about where we go. So over the next couple of days, I'm going to end my comment here. Every now and then I might raise my hand again and say, do you mean mobile money, or do you mean all of fintech, or do you mean financial inclusion, and whose goals are financial inclusion? What are the goals of fintech? And those two don't always line up.
Excellent. Okay.
Thanks. Yeah, I'd just like to add to that we have to be clear exactly what we're talking about when we talk about fintech. I'm jumping ahead to what I'm going to be talking about on Wednesday, but anyway, it's interesting and it's important that when we discuss and when we talk about fintech and that we try to delineate between particular models of fintech. I mean, you've just mentioned, Jonathan's just mentioned there are different types. Mobile money is not the same as fintech, which is a wider concept, but there are different models of fintech. Now, what I am hearing here, and not just here, but everywhere else, you have a particular model of fintech that is driven by the investment community. Now, that's individual investors, institutional investors, pension funds, money market funds, corporations, telecoms, digital payments, and whatever. So you have that is by far the overwhelmingly dominant model of fintech. And so out of that stakeholder, that narrow stakeholder group, comes a set of objectives and rationalizations, which I'll go into certainly on Wednesday, as to why we need more fintech. What I would like to see is to recognize that, and especially if we're talking about development, that fintech also there are other opportunities to adopt and deploy fintech in ways which directly address development needs, not, how to say, artificially inflated or corporate created development needs. I have to say financial inclusion is something that started out with a positive slant on it, and it is now basically the word that describes everything that fintech wants to do. So if MasterCard wants to do something As soon as they say financial inclusion, then that's it. Then you must let them through. Governments must open the doors. World Bank will fund them, de-risk their investments. MasterCard, Gates Foundation, basically all the corporate sector, mention those golden words, and that's the key to getting in there. So I think it's important, before the discussion goes on too long, that we do recognize that there are other models that may be community-owned. Platform cooperatives is one model that are being developed. Public banks, I'm looking at one particular model in Brazil, developed by a community, a publicly owned local bank that is running a fintech model in the way that it thinks is beneficial to the local community. This is completely different to the way that M-Pesa runs. And in fact, what we've been doing is doing a comparison between M-Pesa and this particular model in the city of Marica to the north of Rio, to find that the Marica model is actually doing far more for the community than M-Pesa is doing. And we'll come on to a critique of M-Pesa, I suppose, a bit later. So I think it's important that we at least define what fintech, what we mean by fintech. Whose interests are we talking? Are we on the side of investors, and therefore, we're looking after their interests, or are we on the side of development? And how might fintech be used in such a way that it primarily benefits people at the bottom of the pyramid? I think that's what I'm interested in in this next 4 days, to understand how that might be taken on, and the different experiences that people have in the, I think a few of you are in the corporate sector, in fintechs, how you think, or maybe you are addressing real needs of people, and in ways that are better than could be done by other institutions and other organizations. So I think I've gone on to a little bit too long, but anyway.
Yeah, no, thanks. Quite interesting discussion, especially about, where is the convergence of collaboration between the fintechs, the banks, and, how do we define, this collaboration, and at what point it happens? There's also a big debate that's currently happening, which is it going to be, because I'm coming from the fintech world, and I can tell you, there's been a lot of conversations on banks and fintechs working together, and are we saying we now want to force the marriage of fintechs and banks, because banks also want to become fintechs? And there's a joke that is currently going around, especially in Kenya, that fintechs want to become banks, and banks want to become fintechs, but do fintechs want to become banks? Because of course we've seen the regulator has started to sanitize the market, and CBK has said, even the digital lenders are going to be regulated. And I know Kevin Mutiso is coming in this event. He's going to tell us more about that. But really, there's also a conversation on, is every company going to become a fintech eventually? Even those who have nothing to do with it? Because we're starting to see a lot of the organizations right now embedding credit to their customers, and saying, we're now also offering credit to be competitive. We work with many of these organizations. We work with Twiga Foods, we work with institutions in distribution, supply chain, and that's not their business. They are in the business of distribution and supply chain. But now, all of a sudden, in the midst of COVID, and after COVID, they're saying, look, we're going to give you credit if you buy from us. And other financial services, we can give you savings, we can give you insurance. And so, the question then is the future going to be everyone, whether you like it or not, you're going to be a fintech? And by the virtue of embedding credit or any financial services on top of your infrastructure. And if you work with those who provide, does it also make you a fin and a tech? Because then that's the future of your revenues, because the margins in some of these businesses are very small and tiny, and they have to survive. In the current world, where we have, the economic recession, everyone needs to survive. And so they're starting to look for those margins elsewhere. And where do they find it? Credit. Or offering financial services on top of the infrastructure. So I think, in my view, and I'm going to talk about this in my session on Thursday, really what is the future, where we sit as fintechs, is now becoming very hard to call it, collaboration, because everyone now wants to be that fintech. We've walked into banks and said, can you work with us? We have the infrastructure, you have the money. No, no, no. We're going to do both. And so at what point is this collaboration going to come? Let's be honest with each other. If it's not coming, do we all then build our own infrastructures and become a fintech? Or do we find other ways of collaborating to build an ecosystem that brings everyone together on the table? I don't have an answer.
Between your comments, there's a lot of questions about the future. I think I would agree that, kind of the default we'll get with fintech, absent a concerted effort to make it otherwise, is another set of relatively corporate growth to corporate-based private sector approaches to this. But some of what Hilda's saying already is about how flexible and, in a way, disaggregated fintech is. I mean, if you think about old banks, you put your money in a bank and it was in that bank, and then maybe there was interchange behind, but it was basically you're dealing with a bank. Mobile money, M-Pesa did really well in Kenya because it was about the only country on earth where you had such a concentrated market share that by giving the country a way to share money across its telecom network, you essentially gave everybody in the country a chance to share money across the telecom network. And it's been one of the things that's held back the Safaricom M-Pesa model in other places. Some of the attempts at fintech, even in transfers, has been about making it such that you didn't get stuck inside one network. And you can do that through interoperability, and you can do that with APIs, or you can do that through disaggregation, which we're seeing a lot of, so you can have companies that aren't actually fintechs or banks providing financial services because it's pretty easy to scoop it up and put it on the page, and it works. And I think Shanae and I will talk a little bit about this tomorrow, but this is one of these futures, is like, how do we understand financial services when they've been blown into a million pieces and anybody can serve a little bit of that? We can all talk it through and we can figure out how to regulate around it and make it work for everybody. But it's a new set of challenges that I don't think would have been on people's radar 5-10 years ago. And then there's one other term I want to introduce here, which is the notion of a digital public good, right? Which is a new thing that people are kind of flying a flag about. And I'm not by no stretch am I an expert in digital public goods or digital public infrastructures. But this notion of what are the building blocks that need to get put in place such that there is not a corporate capture or a suboptimal solution in what gets built, so that it gets built for the public good, as whatever that is imagined, is very much a live topic right now. And I think that one thing that all of us might want to think about is, what is the conversation between the human economy people and the financial inclusion people and this growing conversation around digital public goods and digital public infrastructures? What are the places that are building digital public infrastructures to prevent capture or corporatization of financial networks? And then we can, if we wanted to talk about India and the stack, we could do that, or we won't. We'll figure it out at another time. But I know that's a big thing, but I did want to talk about disaggregation on the one hand, and then the notion of a public infrastructure being something that is very live, even in the digital development conversations, which I think connects both of the comments that you guys were making.
So, Jonathan, you mentioned futures, and I think a big question here is like, what is the role of investors, and what's motivating them to invest in certain products? And a lot of these things are kind of evolving definitions. What's the definition for fintech? What's the definition for financial inclusion? It's interesting in Vietnam where I've been working, when a few years ago, if I would Google search mobile money, you would come up with this one company, Momo, which it basically was trying to ride on this excitement about mobile money to get investments, and basically what they provide is a mobile wallet. And then when the government finally provided a kind of regulatory space to develop mobile money by GSMA standards, which is that it does not include banks, it was basically government-linked banks that were allowed to run these services. So the Vitel, which is like the army bank. And that goes back to the first question, which is, what's the limitations of the M-Pesa model? Well, in Kenya, Safaricom and the government have very close connections, so it's very easy to kind of set up those connections. But in other places, you have these fintech companies which are actively trying to bank on the future, trying to promote the future and get investments for that. But then you have different interests in the government, right? And in terms of which players to support the regulations. So again, this idea of the future is quite interesting. And to me, I'd like to learn more about, what is it that motivates investors to go for one fintech company or another, and what is it that, what are the definitions that are being spun to them in order to get that buy-in?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I just wanted to follow up just as a way of trying to understand the landscape of mobile money in maybe Southeast Asia and also Kenya. And because, like what my colleague has highlighted there, there's sort of a dominant discourse of over-romanticization of mobile money, probably because of, these ideas of financial inclusion. But if I'm to look at the Zimbabwean case, for instance, and how mobile money has been manipulated by, of course, different stakeholders, maybe what some people can call predatory kind of capitalism, and speculative activities, which sometimes tends to even affect the very same people that are supposed to benefit from the very same kind of services. So I just wanted to know in Kenya and also maybe Southeast Asia where you work, are there any cases like that? Maybe I can give an example. In Zimbabwe, we have a situation whereby the agents that are probably working together with the telecoms have their own kind of practices, which may not be known by the telecoms, that if I send my mother money from here in South Africa for them to collect the money in maybe some rural area in Zimbabwe, they will not get the money as it is. Rather, there's a commission that is paid. So if I send 10,000 Rand, probably she would only get 80% of the money. Even if I've paid for the transaction as a sender. And you also have a situation where we had agent lines that also engage in speculative activities. So the hard cash, in terms of transactions and exchange rates, would have a different value than the electronic money. And as a result, if someone wants to, say, buy US dollars or sell US dollars and get the local currency, the value that you get to get the actual physical money is actually fundamentally different with electronic money, which has actually led to quite a number of challenges, including the government sometime having to suspend these agent lines because they've been used for some kind of predatory exploitative capitalism, which benefits, of course, different stakeholders and not necessarily the people themselves. So I just wanted to know in different contexts if there are any cases, interesting cases like that.
So your question is about kind of local practices around money and how that maps onto these technologies? I mean, you know, Sibel, maybe you can speak to the Kenya situation, but I mean, I think in the case of Vietnam, where I work, there's long been a history of remittance sending. I did my initial work on international remittances, and there's a fear of rent seeking by both state officials that, I mean, before there were financial remittances, there were material remittances, and you know, government cadres would always take a cut of that, and when the remittances arrive in the local village, oftentimes there's an expectation to share that with neighbors and relatives, and so there's a strong interest in keeping remittances below the radar. There's also other reasons to keep remittances informal. There's money that's transferring both in and out of Vietnam, so you basically have a Hawala-style, you know, kind of situation where there's a lot of bookkeeping to track money that's going out of the country and that's money that's going into the country. But what that does is it keeps transaction fees quite low. You have 1% to 2% transaction fees in the case of Vietnam compared for these informal services compared to, say, Western Union, which would cost 5%. So, you know, when I was working on international remittances, there was always this interest by development practitioners to kind of formalize the remittance economy, saying that this was not a safe practice, right? But in fact, these are long-standing trust networks, and they facilitated migrants who are often working in the underground economy. They didn't want their money to be visible either in Vietnam or in the United States, where they're often earning money under the table and as undocumented migrants. So kind of attending to those needs helps us to kind of understand why there may not be such an excitement to move to more formal remittances, and in this case, domestic remittances, where there would be similar concerns about that money becoming more visible to the government, to your neighbors, to your relatives, et cetera.
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to add, and this is an answer to maybe some of your questions. I think Ethiopia will be very interesting to kind of see as a case study coming up, because we had Kenya, where we had a convergence of factors, you know, that kind of allowed Safaricom and M-Pesa to grow. You have a monopoly situation. And then I think in Zimbabwe, we had hyperinflation that maybe helped in kind of accelerating that growth. So I think, you know, we see what happens in Ethiopia. Do you need, you know, that's a single telco market pretty much, right? There's very, very low competition in terms of the banks. So I think that would be a really interesting thing to see how that works. If it does work and it achieves mass adoption, then I think some of the conclusions could be you need very specific kind of conditions for this. So for us as a company and kind of a fintech in the industry, that's something we're looking out for.
Thanks. Yeah, I think the Ethiopia case I've been looking at is very interesting. M-Pesa hasn't really succeeded anywhere when it's ventured outside of Kenya. And the reason for that is because it hasn't been able to establish a monopoly. One of the things I find always puzzling when talking about the history of M-Pesa is the elephant in the room is that Vodafone basically created a monopoly through illegal means. There was I'm sure maybe you know the history as much as I do, that they created something called Mobitelia Ventures, owned by members of the Kenyan elite. They then lobbied the government to ensure that that M-Pesa would be granted a monopoly, competition would be stifled, and then when they had the market, then a Mobitelia venture. They cashed out, and the people around made about $100 million, okay? So that's something that was done. It's well documented. What I'm interested in is, well, two things, I suppose, is that why that's never sort of, in so much of the history of M-Pesa, you hardly ever see that. There's only just a couple of papers that came out recently about that. Some newspaper articles from a way back. But also, it's coming out now precisely because of the Ethiopian situation. How on earth will Vodafone, because it's still the majority shareholder in Safaricom, how will it, or will it take steps to try to do another type of structure, you know, somehow get the Ethiopian elite into agreeing to a monopoly? If they do, then I think it'll do fantastic. It'll own the market. It'll do just what it did in Kenya. And if it doesn't, then, and they say, no, we want a more competitive environment, which if you listen to the World Bank or the UK government advisors, you know, competition is really important, then it won't succeed. It succeeded in Kenya precisely because they said, we don't want competition, we want a monopoly. So it's interesting and to follow that and to see the ins and outs. I don't think it's been decided yet how it's going to go, but they've certainly put in quite a lot of money already in building up the infrastructure. So maybe they know something we don't.
Thank you. I just wanted to add that, yes, we don't really talk about all the bad things about M-Pesa. For instance, I just Googled it, over 4 million Fuliza loan defaulters added to CRB. We have an overdraft facility that's available for most people with M-Pesa now, and anyone can get a loan whenever with no financial education at 2 a.m. if they're at a bar. So definitely we're not talking about all the bad things that are coming with this financial inclusion. There's not that much in terms of financial education, I find, especially for the unbanked. And I also just wanted to add on to what you said, that in Kenya, it's being driven by the Safaricom and by the telcos, mostly because they already had the market share. They were already in these remote areas where banks weren't, so it was very easy for them to get there. So I'm hoping that this will make it into the paper and more people will actually understand about it.
Yeah, I was avoiding coming back in. Has too many questions for one day. But Sybil, I thought you made a really interesting point earlier in your presentation when you noted that, you know, when you made a point about Kenya's declining health. And I think the statistic you used there was that by whatever measures, financial health was at about 40% in 2015, and in 2020 it had declined to about 15%. Now, my historian's head comes back in here. I'm wondering what this tells us, because right now we're talking about success stories of these fintechs, and yet the financial health of all of these people is declining significantly. And another point I suppose I can make is that following on your point where you're saying there's a market share in remote places, so this is not a new concept. We had post office savings banks when they were established in the mid-1800s. I remember in Zimbabwe, Southern Rhodesia, then it was established in 1905, and it was that specific model. Financial inclusion, lowering transaction costs and all of those things, but what success did they have? Are we not seeing an imperial approach to money again, only in a new technological form? So what does this tell us? The success story of fintechs versus the declining financial health of communities.
I mean, yeah, I agree that it obviously, you know, exposes, I think, a fiction, or at least a disconnect between business success and development, and rather than seeing them as fused together, we see that they're, obviously very distinct here. And I think, the kind of bottom of the pyramid models assume that you can do good and do good for others while profiting yourself. And I think we can see that doesn't necessarily work here. And I think that the reasons are many, right? There are, de-agriculturalization, the structure of the global economy in general, the superiority of the dollar. I mean, there's so many reasons, right, why an economy like Kenya's is not serving its people. So, but we can ask what role Safaricom might play in that if money becomes that medium of love and caring, kind of like what Mario was saying. There's no alternative. Money is love and caring for Kenyan people. So when anyone is in trouble or dies, it's money. It's an imperative to give money because money is caring. So at the same time that you're caring and loving, you're also, paying out to that, I don't know if you want to use the word extraction or whatever, but, someone is profiting from that loving and caring. So that's the paradox, is that it's both together. Yeah. I don't know.
So getting back to what I was mentioning earlier on, money as loving and caring, that's not often the traditional definition of money when it's seen as something that's kind of getting in the way of sociality. And so what is it, at this more kind of meta, economic anthropology level that we can, what are the ways that we can think about money through this work to kind of take away that opposition that is often posed between, say, gifts and money? And why is it that the things that you're finding in your field work, that money is love, why is that not the standard understanding, or do you think that is a changing perception in the field?
Right, I don't know. I mean, like I just did a project for FSD over the summer, and they, for example, they have a very expensive questionnaire that they go house to house on, and involve millions of households in the kind of study of household finance. And there's not a single question about fundraising in there, There's questions about is there someone who could help you if you needed money? There's that kind of question. There's another question called, it goes something like, when was the last time somebody gave you money that you didn't need to pay back? Which tries to get at that, except you do need to pay them back. So it's probably a question. I'm imagining that question is possibly confusing to people, because I don't think it's really tapping into that idea. And so, but there's not a single question about fundraising, which is really ubiquitous, practice. And so I think it's in that domain of, the sacred versus the profane. If money is deeply sacred, and if it's that medium of caring and love, then all those practices could possibly become invisible to people who are asking completely different questions. So then, in the human economy, the way that money is used actually ends up being detrimental, because the people who control money don't understand what people are doing, perhaps, or they're profiting off of that. They're profiting off of it. Maybe they do understand and they're profiting off of it. I think that's more likely. Yeah.
I mean, two things. One, I think one has to distinguish between a story in which inventing new means of payment is going to save the poor. It was always implausible. But you're saying they shouldn't be making profits. But if they are supplying services to people who are better off, why not? Do you have an objection to people making money?
Right.
At all? We should only do it for free?
Right. I know how, someone has to provide the service, I think, and if the MNO is partly producing those networks, it's a part of those networks, and so it's also a member of those networks. Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry, I don't,
No,
I don't follow that entirely. But
yeah.
the other point, if
Yes.
I may, because I said 2 points. I mean, I agree with the idea that we need these case studies in Sudan, in Vietnam, and so on, because each country has its own dynamics and history on this issue. And these inventions, which are fairly standard, fit in different ways. So the case study model, to me, is a good idea. I'm a little concerned when we start being told, well, there are lots of discourses out there, and we've got to look at them all. I mean, that's like the old anthropological tactic, not in the South. You'll know this. Everybody may marry this way, but in the South they do it another way. And you can spend forever on this job. Forever. I think we need to short-circuit this somehow. It's pretty clear the basic service of M-Pesa was fine. And if people object and say, the basic service, which was send money home, people actually were willing to pay for that. So, and poor people were prepared to pay for it. As long as they weren't dragooned into and told every other way of sending money home is going to be banned, and you must pay this. They exercised discretion and said, under circumstances worth paying this fee. When you start adding this whole ecosystem of stuff to it, including highly problematically, and you mentioned it, lending money to people who have none. And the example I've used with you guys is, what do you do when your children look at you and say, Mom, where's dinner? You may know that taking these digital loans is not a good idea, but when the children are crying, what are you going to do? And that's the kind of question we have to address. How do you solve that? It's not just education, I'm afraid. I mean, this financial education is like who knows what it is. We need to figure out more than that. But apart from that, I mean, there are more positive things. The community currency idea, the people's money idea, it's struggling. And Michael Slater says, he's one of the guys in Britain who does it, along with the old man, Tom Greco, in the US. I mean, they say the reason we are struggling so much with this is that we're virtually on our own doing this. There's 2 of us, and they've got a couple of pals. But everybody else sits and talks about, not in the South, we've got to keep compartmentalizing it all and deciding whether this one is better than that one, and this. If it's not basic and people aren't prepared to pay for it, it's no good. Boom. Bottom line. At least that's my view.
I was just going to add, just before you start, sorry, that the M-Pesa Fuliza interest rate is compounding, and it's actually so exploitative. So for me, I would say maybe one of the solutions would be, when someone doesn't have dinner, don't charge them over 200% per year to pay back.
Indeed. So you need regulation which stops them.
Exactly.
But on the other hand, to tell these private companies, when they're dealing with the middle class in wherever, that they shouldn't make any money, that seems to me problematic. They've got to do it. Let them do it. We don't object to paying bank fees.
I mean, just to play devil's advocate. Oh, sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, I disagree with John. There's a huge difference between what we're talking about financial systems. We're not talking about corporations or individuals wanting to invest in companies that make beds or sell vegetables or table lamps or something like that. Fine, let them survive on the market. We're talking about the ownership of the entire financial system. And you can see why there's so much interest in getting into that, because it is it's the golden fleece. If you start to control the entire financial system, or at least significant parts of it, you are made. Okay, so that's why corporations and individual investors are keen to get into that. But what we're going to do is, so it's not just a case of, if you pay or whatever, there are alternatives to that, to allowing the space to be dominated by the investment community or corporations. Let me give you a parallel example. If we were sat here in the 1860s, there were maybe, in the UK, there were maybe 30 railway companies, and they were all fighting to build tracks here, there, and everywhere. It took nearly 50, 60, 70 years to realize that the only way to run a service like the rail system, which was a major transport system, at least before highways came along, was to have it as a monopoly and ideally under public ownership. All countries now accept that, except Britain, of course. We've gone back, we've privatized it, and it's a disaster. So I think the parallel is there with the fintechs, with the financial system. The movement, you see advocacy bodies trying to get rid of cash and substituting it with fintech relationships, which obviously intermediate through MasterCard, Visa, PayPal, JP Morgan, or whatever. Controlling the local financial system is the golden fleece. That is a major endpoint. And if it's just allowed to go ahead and piecemeal, they buy bits and bats of this and that and then fight over it, or as our colleague here said, the banks want the fintechs want banks, then we'll end up in another sort of 30, 40-year dispute over it before we realize, what, we're all in the fintech, in the financial system. Maybe we better all be part of it. Maybe we better all actually own it. And then we can decide how we finance it, whether through taxation or user fees or whatever. But if we go through that same scrabble like they went through in the railways and water and all the others about who's going to pay and who's going to do it, we could save a lot more time if we understand, and we've got a lot more knowledge than we did perhaps in the late 1800s. We would be able to understand that this is a major infrastructure that by definition runs better as a monopoly, and therefore monopolies by definition usually work better under some form of public ownership with the usual democratic safeguards and checks and balances and stuff like that.
I was objecting to that idea.
Okay, well, maybe I misunderstood.
Yeah, I think you did. But in addition, the point I would make countering you is, at this present juncture, the chances of doing this are pretty small. We need an interim measure. I agree with you. That's the long-term goal. That's the long-term objective. But you can't tell these people out there whose children do say to them, "Mum, I'm hungry." Wait, 30 years. You and I won't be here anyway, so it's both. I agree with you. It is, but we need two strategies. But we should go for the jugular on both, not sort of tiptoe around it.
So are we talking about financial extraction and inclusion?
Sorry, I missed that.
No, I was just saying, so is this really financial extraction rather than financial inclusion?
Financial attraction.
Extraction.
Interaction.
Extraction.
Extraction. Yes.
So that's the reality.
And I agree, we agree, that is the thing to look at. How is it happening? But it can't be the only thing we look at because it's so long term. You have to wait for a major change. I mean, goodness, you've got to not only get rid of Liz Truss and the Tory party, but the Labour Party as well. New Labour has stuffed it all up and agrees with these guys. I mean, it's a hard job, long-term job.
If I could, you were speaking about the role of investors, and I'm someone who's transitioned from the sort of development practitioner world to working for an early stage VC. I'll speak tomorrow about our investment thesis, but I think it's important to note that you've got $5 billion that have come into African fintech last year, right? That's almost 2 to 3 times the multiple of the year before. The macro landscape has now deteriorated. VC sentiment is off. So the tech firms that were promising that they'd scale to the masses, that hockey stick would in fact become what it was, that's under scrutiny now. And I think there's a lot more realism about what those valuations look like and who they're actually serving. And we'll speak tomorrow about the middle of the pyramid versus being able to serve the bottom of the pyramid. So there are different fintech models. Not all of them will become unicorns. Some of it may be public banking models. In Brazil, there are case studies from Myanmar where microfinance institutions are able to interconnect and create a layer of interoperability because of a public good like Mojaloop. There are different models around fintech, and it's about what is suitable for which context and for whom. So that's the really interesting point for me.
Quickly, because you've had 15 years to try and do it. I mean, not you personally, the industry.
So my point of interest is understanding which models work where do they break down, and similarly, where are we investing, and where are we partnering with development actors and others, in supporting things that could work around the bottom of the pyramid. Yeah.
But sorry, to add one thing, we're having an interesting conversation. That's why I said in the short run, maybe we should get out of talking about fintech and back the people who want to get into Europe. That's the solution. That's their solution. Britain, Trump is, no matter how many walls he builds along the Mexican border, he's not going to stop people getting across there. No matter, and so on and so forth. Nobody wants, it's uncomfortable. Here it's different. We're ahead. You guys got to catch up. Let them in. If money can flow freely around the world to the tune of $5 billion per day, what gives the right to states acting on behalf of the IFIs to make it so difficult for people to move? That's one solution. And it's a quicker one than thinking we can re-engineer a whole financial system. Let them go. Let's write our support for that. Instead of, we can sit around here, we are not going to resolve this problem. Listen to what they're doing. That's what I said. If you were poor at the bottom of the pyramid, would you be trying to design a new mobile money type system, or would you be making for Europe? If somebody can answer me that question, and why I should say a mobile money type solution, then fine. Then I'll listen.
Well, I mean, speaking of, quickly, speaking of what people at the bottom of the pyramid are actually doing and what they need, going back to what you discussed about microfinance, right? Microfinance has been a model that has been widely critiqued, but there's also different kinds of microfinance, right? And we know that many people who have access to credit need to get small loans, right? So what you mentioned, I mean, if it's M-Shwari, my understanding that M-Shwari was basically no more than $12 for a loan and relatively small interest rates, right? So those kinds of things, they seem like people that they're in demand and that they can help reduce poverty by going to small amounts of debt. But that's different from, these loan sharks, right, that people would otherwise go to. So if that's what people need and there's kind of sustainable microfinance, then perhaps we don't have to kind of throw out the baby with the bathwater and critique the whole system, but find what is the, I mean, the poor are, already financially educated in many ways, right? They know what they need and they know what is sustainable, but the problem is that their access is so limited, and so these small loans, it seems like if done right, could provide some services that are actually demanded.
Two things really quickly. remittances are a way of having at least some of your family make to Europe.
Sorry, I didn't.
Remittances, international remittances are partly about solving the fact that not everybody can move, right? Somebody goes and then the money comes back. It is at least putting somebody in your family where the money is, where the money can be earned, and then sharing the money, right? So, you know, perhaps in a world where things weren't so scarce and there was more productivity and more going around, there'd actually be less migration, there'd be less remittances and all that. So there are other ways to solve it other than having kind of, you know, saying, well, if there's nothing we can do for you here, you better move, you know. But some people do move, and that's why it's all complex, you know.
It's pretty complicated. I'm not sure it's a boon to everybody.
It's not great for everybody, but you know, the part of why it's there is because families are stretched across multiple countries, and some people earn in some place and support people who live in other places, which is, thank goodness we have remittances, you know, in that sense. But the other question I wanted to tie back to these questions of kind of what infrastructure are we building? Martin, your question was, you know, it's okay for markets, or it's okay for sort of private things and I think you used shoes and vegetables and railroads or something like that, but somehow money is different, you know. It may be that money is different, and it may be that the financial infrastructure is different, but it might be that even if it is different, that the moment we're in now, and what we're finding is how easily digitizable money and the store of value and the production of value is, means that digital money plays by digital rules in a way that railroads don't, and vegetables don't, you know, and shoes don't. And it may be that the central control, even in a public interest, of financial infrastructures in a digital era may be harder to pull off than some, I think, want it to be. It's very difficult questions right now about what the future of money will look like as it goes entirely digital. And that's why the questions we're asking here and the tensions we're raising are really important. I don't have answers, but I do know that money will continue to move more quickly than people do. Money will hide in people's wallets and then also simultaneously be somewhere else in ways that we can barely imagine. But it's crazy, but that's the essence of digital. And every now and then, we know that we bump into things that makes that painful and makes those disruptions painful, like being able to get a loan at 2:30 in the morning when you've been gambling, you know, which is, there's nothing wrong with gambling, there's nothing wrong with having a loan, nothing wrong with having a smartphone, but you put all of those together and it's 2:30 in the morning and people end up in a hole, you know, and that is because of the sort of the essential digitalness of the ability to take a loan now. So, you know, as we are kind of working with the M-Pesa example quite a bit, but the M-Pesa example is not the future of money. It's not even the present of money. To some extent, it's like 10, 15 years old when it was kind of this network that kind of worked with the cash in, cash out, and you know, they wanted to keep it all cash, but they wanted to keep it all Safaricom. They didn't want to have it all interoperable or whatever. The frontiers of figuring out digital money far exceed what Safaricom and M-Pesa is. And I think we are just getting started on what that will look like. And again, injecting the public incentives into that and public outcomes and outcomes for the poor are going to be really important as those systems get built and regulated and even imagined.
Sorry, I'm not so sure I'm getting your point about the digitalization of money. I don't know if I'm hearing you correctly. Are you saying digital money is, I suppose, neutral? No, okay, because Yeah, I missed that point, because I was just going to bring in a point about power. Yes. Yes, that's what I wanted to sort of bring in, that dynamic, that this might be digital money, but these techpreneurs are billionaires in US dollar terms, right? And whatever digital money that we're talking about, it has to be converted, or it tends to be converted into something that it is apparently anchored on, right? So if we consider that dynamic, what does that then mean for whatever infrastructures and platforms that we're building? So in that sense then, it's certainly not neutral. And whatever we're talking about, whether it's inclusion, extraction, I think the whole notion of extraction is particularly important. How does power feature in there, and how does it shape how we view what's happening in all of these different cases?
Yeah, I kind of feel a bit compelled to say something about Moos, because I edited a volume of Moos articles on money in German a couple of years ago, and I think what we need to consider is that coming back to money as a form of caring, I think that's something that Moos explicitly warned against, that is not supposed to happen. And that is what you can see in places maybe like Kenya, when you find a young man at 2 a.m. and he's having access to mobile money and he wants to maybe engage with a girlfriend or something, and he has access and he gambles. That is precisely because money has become an index of caring, or a sign of caring, or even like a substitute for it. But I think for Moos, what's interesting in Moos is that he talks about, like Milford mentioned, the money and financial infrastructure for Moos should develop in a way that it signals society's love for itself, for the whole society, and not for individual, companies or individuals who profit from it. And I think that's something that is helpful to think along, like what kind of financial infrastructure can we build that helps to build a society that we would love to live in. And when you approach it that way, I think majority of people, when you talk with them, would also say, yeah, it would be better if we don't need money to convince. For example, in my case, I spent some time with migrant men in Nairobi, and they talked a lot about female expectations. It would be better if we don't need money to take out a girlfriend. But right now we need it, and there's no alternative. And like I said before, there's no discussion about an alternative. And that's also what do we speak about inclusion? Inclusion into what? Shouldn't we also talk about financial exclusion? Is it not good to keep some people out of it, or some people, like all these kinds of things I think are interesting when we talk about Mosian legacies in economic anthropology that are also not quite known. Like, as Ivan was saying, majority is always focusing on the gift stuff, yet there is a whole literature on money that unfortunately it was not translated to German, and I think a lot of it is also not translated into English yet.
Sorry, we need to stop. But still, we know that his exchange with Malinowski, sorry, this is in-house, his exchange with Malinowski in the book, I mean, he is pointing to the fact that there's a particular kind of money which Malinowski took for granted. That's money, what we know all around us, and the Trobriand Islanders don't have it. So they have the gift. That's what you're talking about. And of course, the point that Moos made was, well, if you change the definition of money, then they do have money. And it's that. Now we have to realize this, we need to be analyzing the kind of money which many of us take for granted as the only possible form that money can take. But we forget, we were talking about this earlier, we forget the greenback didn't settle down until the 1870s. Finally became universal currency in the United States? Somewhere like that. It's fairly recent, and it is changing. I mean, we know other institutions than banks acting under license from the state, as it were, are also creating money. Now, there's a question there. What promise do those new forms of money have? I think mobile money, beyond its function as P2P transfers, is problematic. That's what I would say. It's just because people conceptualize it. So many, both in the industry, see it as a replacement. If it is a replacement for cash or fiat, it's going to take on all the characteristics of fiat or cash. And cash is deliberately scarce, and you have to pay for it. And what your dad or your children, you know, they want their dinner whether you can pay for it or not. That's the key issue to, I think, focus on. This is the powerful. Can we think of new forms, a new form of money, not something that is just a replacement for something we know is inherently unequalizing. It creates inequality because it's always scarce, because the rich will always hoard it and not make it available to the mass of the population, who then have to go and get these loans at 2 a.m. So I would say this is a very, I think, in a very important area. We've got to understand, and maybe we all have to do it, is to persuade the public at large that this form of money, which we take for granted, and we've taken it for granted ever since Adam Smith, because he let it emerge out of exchange. It was a means to exchange things. Well, it was many other things besides that, which he didn't talk about. And we need to tell them Smith's definition is highly problematic. But you talk to anybody in industry around the world, and they're going to say, it's natural. The money we've got is natural. And it's not. And there are other ways to do it, which is what Mose gently reminded Malinowski when he said the Trobrianders don't have money, they have gift exchange. Well, change the definition of money and they were exchanging money. And it met some of those criteria that we are looking at. Concern, you know, but it doesn't always work. And he was very clear, Mose was very clear, that there was competition in that. It wasn't kumbaya. There was competition as well as caring for other people. And we're going to have to live with that, I think. That's probably the bottom line. You're not going to get this money that breeds happiness and coexistence forever. Okay, can I just say, we are going on to the main campus for dinner tonight. The bus will leave at 6 o'clock. Can I suggest that we meet, and they're going to be outside here, where the turning area is outside the gate. So can we meet at 5 to 6? If that's possible. Thank you very much.